Hey, it's Steve from Nebraska Star Beef, and we are gonna cover one of the most commonly asked questions that we've had here at Nebraska Star Beef in the last 13 years we've been doing this. And that question is, how long should I cook a steak? So if that's something you've wondered about, what the appropriate cook time for a steak is, hang around. I think you might enjoy this video. I think it may go in a direction that's a little different than what you're thinking, but hang out and come along for the ride. Come out the other end, I guarantee you're gonna know a little bit more about cooking a steak. Now, that is one of the most difficult questions if we are going to use time as a barometer. Time, I love time. But there's a much simpler way that's much more accurate and much more effective. We'll get to that here in a little bit. But the reason that time, or how long I should cook that steak, is a really difficult, probably borderline impossible question to answer, is that there are so many variables. How thick is the steak? How much fat is in the steak? What kind of heat source are you using? Is it a stovetop? Is it a grill? Is it a charcoal grill? Is it a gas grill? What's the heat setting? What's the temperature outside? What's the temperature of the steak before you start cooking? Lots and lots and lots of variables go into the amount of time that we're going to cook a steak. And while there may be some ways to back into cooking the perfect steak on one grill with similar steaks in similar weather, you know, you can say 4 minutes on one side and 3 minutes on the flip side will get you pretty close. There's still only one way to truly know if that steak is done exactly the way you want it done. And that is the internal temperature of the steak, not the time. The time is what the time is. The steak is done when the thermometer says it's done. Okay, so Steve, you're telling me that there's no right amount of time to cook a steak. Yeah, that's true. The internal temperature is what's going to determine the correct amount of time. The internal temperature is the lowest common denominator. And most thermometers, most cooking thermometers will have a little guide printed on them. We'll give you a close-up of that here in a sec. But typically, if you're looking for a rare steak, that's going to be in the 110 to 115 degrees Fahrenheit internal temperature. Medium rare is probably going to push, 115 to 125. Medium is going to be in that 125 to 130 range. Anything north of a finish temp of 130 is going to be getting solidly into medium and approaching medium well, which is awfully done for a steak. Now, when you start talking about burgers, that 140, 145 finishing temp gets to be pretty close to the sweet spot, but ground meat is a little different animal than steaks. The answer to that question is a little bit subjective because different people like their steaks cooked different ways. People like their burgers cooked different ways. To produce a really juicy, tender, delicious steak, cooking the steak to medium rare is something that I think the majority of people, not all people by a long shot, the majority of people seem to favor a medium rare steak or something in the spectrum of medium rare. There are people who like steaks more rare. There are people who like steaks blue rare. which is essentially just searing both sides of the steak and leaving the center cool, below 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So the best internal temperature is very difficult to say. In burgers, you know, if you're making hamburgers, the sweet spot for what makes the best burger is quite a bit warmer temperature than what you're gonna have for, let's say, a ribeye or a filet mignon. Burger probably is gonna land closer to that 140, 145 finish temp. One other thing to keep in mind when you're using internal temperature as the cooking barometer is that when you pull the steak from the heat source, there is almost invariably going to be a phenomenon called coast-up, or at least that I call coast-up. And that is, that steak comes off the grill, let's say at an imaginary 119, 120 degrees. We take the steak off the grill and we put it on the cutting board to rest. Now, what happens in this resting period is the internal temperature of that steak, from the heat being on both sides of the steak, the temperature inside the steak is going to equalize, and it will typically increase somewhere between 7 and 10 degrees Fahrenheit. So if your ideal finish temperature, if your ideal serving temperature is 130 degrees, you want to take that steak off the grill somewhere around 120, 122, and let it rest. And when I say rest, I'm at least 5 minutes. 10 is probably better, but what will happen is that the temperature inside the steak will reach an equilibrium, and then that steak is, at that point, that's the best time to eat that steak, is after it's been cooked, rested, the temperature goes up and then starts to come down. That's where you want to start slicing the steak. My mouth's watering just talking about this. And again, this is a highly personal thing. Everybody can have their own, and I don't think anybody that truly loves beef judges the way that anybody likes their steaks cooked, with one exception that we're not going to talk about. But if you know, you know. Personally, I like mine rare. If I'm at a restaurant that has a high temp broiler, blue rare is my absolute favorite. I can do it on a cast iron skillet at home. It gets a little smoky, but I like a well-seared steak with a cool to very slightly warm center. Typically a New York strip, 16-ounce New York strip. You probably heard me say that in a few other videos. I'm not offended by porterhouses either. And on the burger side, burgers are a little different. And I cook a lot of burgers here at the office, especially during harvest. Right now we're in the middle of wheat harvest, so I end up spending a fair bit of time on the grill. And one of the favorite things for the guy to cook for the guys is burgers. And when I'm finishing burgers, what I'm looking for is a temperature of 140 to 145 when those burgers come off the grill and they go in my I have a big roasting pan that all the burgers will go into coming off the grill that stays covered. And as those burgers sit in the grill, it's kind of like a group rest for those burgers, or any, you know, and the temperature will coast up into the low 150s, but you still end up with a nice pink center. Everything's cooked, they're still juicy, they're crazy delicious, but it's a very different finishing temperature and cooking procedure than what I would do if I were cooking steaks for everybody. That would be a much lower finishing temperature on a much hotter grill, just to get a quick sear, get that internal temp. And if I'm cooking for a group, typically what I'll do is take the internal temperature to somewhere between our office group, the internal temperature to between 115 and 120, those steaks then will coast up almost invariably to the high 120s, low 130s, and that yields a very, very nice rare, medium rare finish. That's what everybody here at the office likes, so that's what I do. Okay, so that's it for the week. Internal temperature owns how to tell when a steak's done. The amount of time, it's just too subjective. There's too many variables. And if you feel like I kind of took a dump on Uncle Frank's, hey, make sure you can only hold your hand over the charcoal for 3 seconds and then 5 minutes on the first side, 4 minutes on the second side, it'll be a perfect steak every time, no matter what the steak. Just not true. As much as I wish I could sit here and say Uncle Frank nailed it, Uncle Frank may have a really good idea and he may be a great artistic griller, but at the end of the day, if you want to cook a steak scientifically the best way, the most accurate way, the most consistent way, and you don't already have a thermometer, get a thermometer, figure out what the finishing temp you like on your steak is, and then no matter how you cook those steaks, whether it's the oven, the stovetop, the grill, the charcoal grill, the campfire, whatever it is, watch that internal temp. It will tell you when the steak's done. And that's all we got for this week. So go eat a steak.